welcome to Bach Talk. I'm your host, Carlton Monroe, and I'm glad to have you listening or watching. Today's a little different from previous Bach Talks, in part because people have busy schedules, and normally we like to have a presentation with our guest lecturer, Adam Schoaf, who gives background into the music of an upcoming Bach Vespers, and then have a chance to speak to some of the performers that will be featured on the Vespers. However, we couldn't get everybody together at the same time, even through the miracle of Zoom. So instead, we've split it up into two podcasts, two videos that you can watch separately. And today I am joined by two members of Seven Hills Baroque, which is a new early music ensemble in Cincinnati, and is an ensemble in residence at St. Thomas, and will be our featured musicians for the Bach Vespers on Sunday, December the 12th. So I'm very happy to be joined by Michael Delfín and Josh Bermudez. Josh, Michael, welcome. Glad to have you here.
Thank you so much. Glad we could be here.
Great. So let's start with maybe the simplest question, or maybe it's the hardest one. I don't know. What is Seven Hills Baroque? Michael, what is this group?
Seven Hills Baroque is an early music ensemble based in Cincinnati, and our mission and goal is to perform music of the 15th through 18th centuries on period instruments, and do so in as many different possible locations in Cincinnati, reaching many different audiences, and also to amplify voices of neglected composers, whether they are Black, Indigenous, people of color, or women, or other minorities as we discover.
Excellent. Josh, how did it start? I mean, you all knew one another, obviously. What was the genesis of this?
So I actually got involved relatively late. Michael and our other current member, Lauren McAllister, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, had known each other for quite a while. And we also had a fourth member, Brian Lyons, who is now working at a school in the Netherlands on Baroque Bow. They had the idea of forming this organization to kind of fill a gap in Cincinnati's music offerings. And I had met Michael. Well, I'd known of Michael for a while because, CCM, everybody knows Michael.
Right.
And somehow, I guess we got in a conversation about period performance, and we had the idea of playing a Beethoven piano trio using the school forte piano, and I own a Baroque cello with gut strings. So that's how we initially kind of started interacting, was through the idea of playing music together. And then we realized that we're both giant music nerds and love period performance. So he asked me to join Lauren and Brian and him on this venture. And that's the genesis as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Okay. That's fantastic. You said something that really interests me. You mentioned a kind of a gap in early music in Cincinnati, and that I think that's pretty observant. I think that there is great interest in Cincinnati in early music, but not necessarily a large number of performances. Michael, is that kind of your perception? How long have you been in Cincinnati? I know.
I got here in the middle of 2016
Yeah.
to start a piano degree, and wound up doing harpsichord too. I like to describe myself as like C.S. Lewis, a reluctant convert,
Okay.
and now a huge fan. When I got here, Catacoustic Consort was still very active and had an incredible following for a period ensemble, and they were largely the only ones. There have been smaller groups popping up here and there, and um, they might have two, three concerts a season. And unfortunately, when Annalisa left Cincinnati, Catacoustic seems to have at least gone with her or dispersed into other parts of Ohio. and she's doing amazing things in Europe right now. Um, we realized in 2019, because Carlton, that's when you and I met.
Right.
We started talking, well, how can we bring period music performance back to Cincinnati? Lauren and I had talked about this. Brian and I talked about this, and I remember my eyes bulging out of my skull in a counterpoint class with Josh when he said he had a Baroque cello. So we realized there's so much Baroque music happening in Cincinnati through Collegium, through the Bach Ensemble of St. Thomas. Even CSO will do a concert once a season, and the audiences absolutely eat it up. It's well done on modern instruments, and it's engaging music with engaging stories behind it normally, but there wasn't anyone doing it on period instruments. And by that we mean Baroque designs, um, pitch tuned differently from 440, usually what we consider now a half step below, although it could be variable at the time. And so we thought we should try to make this happen again because it's interesting. It's not done much in this area, and it's very engaging from a historical standpoint, from community standpoint, even the science behind the instruments. It's just a fascinating field.
You're heading in exactly the direction I wanted to ask you about. In fact, what I'll do is because you're talking about one of the things I want to do is explain to people that may not even know what we're talking about when we say early music. So specifically, some of the differences between modern instruments and early music instruments. Josh, for example, the Baroque cello and the bow. What could you explain? What some of those fundamental differences are?
Yes, I would absolutely love to. First off, let me start by saying the idea of it being a Baroque cello is kind of a misnomer. What cellists play today is very much a 20th century cello. So I mentioned earlier that Michael and I met because we wanted to play Beethoven piano trios. Beethoven's cello resembled what we call a Baroque cello, even though we don't consider him a Baroque composer. But his cello much more closely resembled that rather than the cello we have today. The cellos that we use today were designed specifically with the value of loudness in mind, because throughout the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, concert halls have gotten larger and larger, and the focus of being a musician, a professional musician, turned into concerto performing. And so if I'm playing on a cello in front of an orchestra in a huge hall, I need an instrument that's very loud so the person in the back of the hall can hear me even if the rest of the orchestra is playing too. So modern cellos have metallic strings. We have a tighter tension on the strings and the body of the instrument, all to produce this loudness. Before this modern era of instrument making, the value was on richness of the sound. So my Baroque, I'll call it a Baroque instrument, even though it's not. My Baroque instrument has gut strings, so they're made out of sheep intestine, I believe. You can get them in cow intestine as well. But it's sheep gut that's been wound. Yeah, yeah. I've never tried eating it. Maybe I should.
I would recommend shopping for these at your local Kroger.
Yeah.
Yes, no. So it's been twisted, and it has a much more warm sound to it. It has a much more, to me, interesting sound to it, which can make it also more difficult to play on because it does have more differences. Like I can show up to my cello one day and it'll sound completely different because depending on the humidity, depending on the temperature, the strings could just sound different.
And
that's a different day.
That's different from a modern instrument, which is maybe more consistent in sound?
Yes, modern instruments are designed, you want to show up every day to play your concerto and it sounds exactly the same and it feels exactly the same. There's still a lot of variation,
Sure.
but so gut strings is a big difference. And the gut strings, like I mentioned on the modern instruments, the gut strings are not nearly as tight on the instrument as modern strings would be. So that makes them softer in the room because, again, these instruments weren't being made to be played in giant concert halls. They're made to be played in your living room or in a church where the acoustics are going to carry the sound no matter what. You mentioned the bows. This kind of crosses over. So I do play my Baroque cello with a modern style bow as well. Corelli's bow, if you know the famous Italian Baroque violinist, his bow was more closer to a modern style bow than to what we consider a Baroque bow. So things were in flux in the 18th century. But a Baroque bow, all right, let's start with modern. A modern bow has a convex curve to it, kind of curves this direction with the stick, and then the hair is flat. A Baroque bow is the opposite. The hair is still flat, and the stick curves this direction, which means that you produce sound in a slightly different way. It's more about using the bow to produce sound rather than using weight or the friction of the bow. It's about using more bow speed, which gives it a more light, I would say, sound. It doesn't always, I'm generalizing, but it does give it a more light sound that's perfect for stuff like the Bach suites. They're supposed to be dances, and so it should have this kind of lift to the sound rather than the downward trajectory of like a modern bow.
Can you all hear my dog barking in the background? Yeah.
Yes.
I'm alone in my house. There's nothing I can do about it except try to calm her down a little bit. So, hi, we just took a quick break so that I could quiet down a pet. So, but Josh, you were talking about the difference between a period bow and the modern bow, and the instruments. And one of the things that kind of struck me is that even in period early music, there isn't a particular one correct answer for what kind of instrument, what kind of bow. That there was fluctuation, even even hundreds of years ago, in how these things were utilized. Is that accurate?
Absolutely, and also in how the music was played. One of the pushbacks that I often get from performers who aren't interested in this kind of period performance, that just want to do modern performance. One of the pushbacks I get is, well, aren't you locked in as a performer, like, oh, you just have to play it this one way every time, and you're just trying to do what the composer wanted and what's on the page, and that's so boring. And no, that's not true. There's so many choices that you get to make as a performer, even when you're respecting as much of the research of what happened in that time period as we have. There's still lots of decisions to be made, and lots of acceptable might be a little bit too strong of a word, but lots of allowable ways that you can play the same music. So there's still lots of freedom as a performer. But for me, the beauty in it is in connecting the people that I'm playing for in 2021 get to share an experience with people from 300 years ago that they literally can't ever meet, but they're getting to share this experience through time. And I think the best way of doing that is by making the music, that connection, and be as close to the original as possible, so that this like time capsule can be preserved as best as possible.
That's really wonderfully said. Michael, what are your thoughts on quote, period performance in modern day?
I used to think it was a very stuffy thing, and possibly because the early recordings I was exposed to years ago were very much by what we like to think of as the purists. You can play it only certain ways, and any variance from that is antithetical to the composer's intent. But then the more we explore the writings, the more we realize just how much freedom there was in improvisation, in ornamentation, in character and affect. How one delivers the spirit of the music was so much more important than the notes on the page. And
That
the
that
various.
really is an interesting point, and it relates to what we do at the Bach Ensemble, which is a modern instrument ensemble. We currently do not do performances with period instruments, although we use the term historically informed because we try to play in a way that is not a modern style of playing, but a more Baroque style of approaching the music. But there are really interesting ways in which it's almost impossible for us to fully recreate what Bach was intending. For example, if we were doing this authentically, we would have voice sopranos singing all of the soprano parts, and we don't. We use adult sopranos, but one of the more recent developments is, believe it or not, teenagers' voices are changing earlier in age than they used to, and that in the 17th century and in the 18th century, boys' voices would remain unchanged much later, into when they were 15 or 16. And one of the kind of effects of that, which you might not think about, is that you can have boys with much longer musical training, right? They can be training in this music since they were 8 or 9. And so when you have a 16-year-old soprano, that's someone who potentially had been studying singing and music for 8 years. Whereas now, when we see voices changing around 12 or 13, those same singers only have 3 or 4 years of experience. And so then you add in the complexity of Bach's music, and it becomes actually very difficult to train young voices to sing Bach's cantatas because their voices change too soon. And it's one of those ironic developments, just sort of this intersection of a lot of different aspects of that affect what we're able to do with modern performances. So anyway, I think that's really fascinating. So, Michael, let's go back to Seven Hills, and maybe you could lay out some of the vision you have for the group in the years to come, long term. What are the kinds of things you're hoping to do? Obviously, I hope you continue to be an ensemble in residence for St. Thomas for quite a long time. Let's start with that one. But beyond
Absolutely.
that, what are some of the things you'd like to do?
Well, we also hope for the same, so thank you.
Yeah.
uh, because the number of period performers in the area is not huge. We we have been sourcing performers from outside Cincinnati. We're actually having a violinist from New York join us next weekend, as we had one another recent Juilliard grad join us back in September when we played in Kentucky. So we're looking to source for more performers. We are starting an educational component to the ensemble, which I will leave Josh to talk about because that was his brainchild, and it's actually happening next month. Lauren introduced us to Maria Antonia Walpurgis. I'm not even sure how to say her name, who is a composer of an opera about the Queen of the Amazons, and it's all female cast. And that's a project we're mostly just planning and brainstorming right now, but to actually expand our forces enough to be able to tackle big projects like this of almost completely unheard repertoire. Uh, Certainly more chamber music, expanding our performance base beyond Cincinnati. Those are the more practical things, but the exploration of repertoire is particularly interesting to us. And Josh, if you want to talk about
Yeah, Josh, I want to hear
education.
about the educational program.
Yeah, so there's actually a couple things I want to talk about. I'll start with education. So we had this idea, well, a year ago when we started, but then COVID happened, and so we weren't able to capitalize on it yet. But there's hundreds, if not, well, no, there's definitely thousands of kids around Cincinnati who are in string programs or learning piano in local schools who probably have never been introduced to the other versions of the instruments they play. They only know, the ones they take their lessons on. So I had this idea of let's take our instruments into local schools and let's show them. Because at least well, no, it's true on piano too. A lot of the beginner pieces that you learn when you're learning a cello or a piano or a violin are Baroque pieces. So let's take these instruments in and let's show them like, oh, your instrument could also sound like this, depending on what time period it was in. And also introduce the idea that just because these are old instruments doesn't really mean that it has to be old music. If we're still playing it and audiences are still finding something to appreciate in these sounds, then they're still new instruments. So if we can get kids excited about the range of timbres that are available in these same instruments that they're learning, we can broaden their interest in different kinds of music, perhaps. So yeah, starting in January, second week, I believe, we're going to start going into schools and performing for kids and kind of having discussions with them. The other discussion that I really want to have is like how the values of music that we have today, where if you listen to music, it's probably on headphones on Spotify, very curated, is much more similar to the music experience of, let's say, Bach's time, where if you heard music, it was either at church, which still happens today, or it was in your living room where you chose what you got to play. In this case, you're not listening on headphones, you're playing it yourself. But it's still a very much more curated, personally curated music experience than the concert hall experience that is more familiar to classical music today. So I wanted to make that connection for students as well.
I think it's really important too. Sorry to interrupt you. I think it's important too because we've all grown up with the traditional classical model of, a big hall, a big orchestra, 20th century opening piece, concerto, then an intermission, then a symphony. I mean, for many generations, that is classical music, and I think one of the things that is important going forward is to kind of introduce people to the other aspects of classical music and of early music, because that particular presentation is only one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to mention, I completely agree with what you just said, yes. So there's actually three kinds of work that we're hoping to do in Cincinnati. One is the educational outreach I just talked about. Another is just the typical concert style performances like you were just talking about, where people who are classical music nerds like us, we're fine going and sitting for 2 hours and being quiet in a chair and listening
Right.
to music. The third kind of outreach we really want to do is to find more approachable venues to take this music into that will make us as musicians more accessible to our audience, and also venues where we can interact with the audience and kind of blur those lines between musician and audience, where we can do sing-alongs of period repertoires like sea shanties and vernacular songs, and we can get the audience to become part of the music making and make this old music more real and more relevant to their everyday lives, where it can be fun and just an enjoyable experience. And we can reach out to people who wouldn't have any interest in sitting down for 2 hours and shutting up and listening to Bach.
That's fantastic. Okay, well, we're probably getting close to wrapping up, but before we go, I'd love to just hear a little bit about some of the music that you're going to perform as part of the Vesper service. So, Michael, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the pieces that you'll be playing?
Sure. We owe an enormous debt of gratitude to Lauren for finding these Spanish Christmas Carol type pieces. I believe one of which, at least one was written in Mexico, and I believe by a Mexican Baroque composer. The pieces that Lauren found reflect the enthusiasm of the listeners who, or the people who would have sung them at the time. They're very much about the joy of the Christmas season. Some of them are almost silly in nature. They're just that fun, and we're working on programming that kind of raucous joy into the pieces. We're also looking at Buxtehude and Charpentier, two composers Bach would have known, and in fact, he knew Buxtehude very well. Got him in trouble with his bosses when he went off for a couple months to go study with him. That's a great story. If you're a church musician, don't tick off your employers. It's a bad
Yeah, I don't think my employers at St. Thomas would be too happy with
idea.
that. So Spanish, French, German, all on the
Yes,
program, and
and the
then there's a concerto too, right?
yes, the Bach Concerto that we are doing as a Baroque string quartet and harpsichord ensemble is the piece that I performed in the final round of the Juro International competition, which turned out very well.
Yes, absolutely. You can go ahead and tell us the results of that competition in
Okay.
case people didn't know what happened.
Well, they did not award a first prize that year, but I tied for second prize
Excellent.
with a very dear friend of mine from Indiana. There were many hugs that evening. We were all very happy. And this piece is particularly joyous in a time like we are living in right now, when sometimes joy is in short supply. This piece sandwiches between two very ebullient and almost over the top radiant movements, especially the final movement. Um, a very poignant and sorrowful arioso type of adagio for the harpsichord to just sing throughout. And I think Josh gets the best part because his is the bass line holding everything together. And um, the the joy really counterbalances that. And I think in a time like now, it's very welcome. It's very welcome to experience that. So it's a fantastic piece.
I can't wait to hear it, and I'm excited because this will be unlike a typical Bach Vespers in many ways. But I'm excited because for that same reason, I think it will be a kind of a new window for us to look at this music. So it's going to be wonderful. All right, I think on that note, we can wrap things up. But as I said, Seven Hills Baroque will be our featured musicians on the Bach Vespers on Sunday, December 12th. It's a special time. It's 7 p.m. This will be Bach Vespers by candlelight. I'm very happy to have had Michael and Josh join me. Guys, thanks so much for this conversation, and we look forward to the music.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us, yeah, and hosting us too. It's been great.